It's time for the word of the week. Let's dive right in. This week our word is barbaros, barbarian, or its plural, barbaroi. So the basic meaning of barbaros, if we go back to its earliest beginnings, is stammering, stuttering, or uttering unintelligible sounds. There's a verb form, barbaridzane, that's the infinitive form, and it means to cackle like a bird. That's the way it's used to describe noises like birds cackling, chattering. So if you think about the noise that birds sometimes make, we don't know what they're trying to communicate. We just hear bap, 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 right? So it's like the barbaroi, the barbarians, were those who uttered unintelligible sounds. In other words, a language that I don't understand makes you seem to me like a barbarian. So over time, barbaros went from the stammering and stuttering to a person who speaks a foreign language. So someone that I can't understand is barbaros to me. Eventually, it takes on a geographical and cultural component. No longer is it just a person who I don't understand. It's whole people groups and places who speak foreign tongues, who have foreign cultures, and who are not easily understood by me. So people who are not like us, we tend to consider barbarians. Specifically, historically at that time, it would be non-Greeks, because we're studying a Greek word, and it was used in Greek society, and people who didn't speak Greek or have Greek culture were thought to be barbaros. They sounded like birds chattering. They don't speak a civilized tongue like the Greeks did. In the pre-Alexandrian world, in other words, before Alexander the Great, non-Greeks are seen as different, uncultured, or even a poorer culture. If we think about the big world powers prior to Alexander, they're thinking about the Persians to the northeast and the Egyptians to the southeast. Big world powers that are very, very different in lifestyle and language from the Greeks in the Mediterranean. After Alexander the Great, there's a shift in the world. Alexander reaches out and touches so many places. He spreads the Hellenized culture, the Greek culture, so far. They encounter so many different people groups and work toward assimilation with those people groups that their exposure to the foreign is much greater than it is prior to Alexander the Great. So after that, they see and experience other cultures and other kinds of people. But here's the thing that we have to keep in mind. Human beings, wherever we're from, whatever the time period, are incredibly tribal in our nature. So the word barbaros winds up taking on an even more pejorative sense. It's no longer now just that the barbaroi are of a different language or have different customs. Barbaroi are now seen as being wild or fierce, uncivilized people, crude, right? So we look at our modern use of the term barbarian. If you call someone a barbarian today, you're not saying, I don't recognize the specific dialect you speak. You're saying that is a wild, crude, uncivilized person, a barbarian. This reminded me of something from when I was in the Army. There's a phenomenon in the Army that everyone recognizes after not very long. The place that you just left did everything right, and the place where you've just arrived does everything wrong. That's just an example of our tribalism. I was a part of the tribe that I just left. I knew how things worked. I spoke the language. I understood where I fit in the system, and so everything seemed right. But then when I got to the new place, I was the outsider. I wasn't a part of the system yet, and so everything seemed wrong. But as you're assimilated, as you become a part of the tribe, that becomes the new normal. That's your new place where you fit. And when you leave that place, you'll think everything there was right and everything in the new place is wrong. Because we are tribal that way. Wherever we don't understand how things are done, those people seem to us barbarian. Let's take a look then in the New Testament. How does this word fit into the New Testament? I'm glad you asked. It appears in 4 different places. The first is in Acts chapter 28 and verses 2 and 4, where Paul is on the Isle of Malta after a shipwreck. And it very literally deals with the folks of Malta who speak a different language and have a completely different culture. They're insular because they live on an island. And Paul and his Hellenized companions relate to these people whose language they don't understand and describe them as barbarians. But we're going to look at 3 other verses that illustrate more about the word. In 1 Corinthians 14, verses 10 and 11, Paul is talking about the gifts of the Spirit, specifically speaking in tongues. So the context is people within the church claiming to have a spiritual gift of speaking in tongues, and Paul is addressing the intelligibility of the things that are being spoken while these people are claiming to speak in tongues. Let's take a look. This is the ESV, and I'm supplying the Koine. There are doubtless many different languages in the world, and none is without meaning. But if I do not know the meaning of the language, I will be a foreigner, a barbaros, to the speaker, and the speaker a foreigner, a barbaros, to me. So notice that Paul goes with barbaros in this passage and not xenos. We might expect xenos, like xenophobic, fear of the foreigner, of the alien. But instead of xenos, he goes here with barbaros. Why? Because the context is about speaking language and being understood. So he goes to a word that deals with the foreigner, but more from the standpoint of language. Paul's a genius, as I always say, right? So look at what he says. Now I want to make a disclaimer. What I'm about to say is not exegetically on point. Paul's issue here is with speaking in tongues and intelligibility of what is said. I'm extrapolating from that an ancillary, maybe even a tertiary lesson. But look at what he says about it. If we don't understand what's being said, it makes us seem barbaros to one another. I seem like a barbarian to you if you don't understand me, and you seem like a barbarian to me if I don't understand you. A lack of understanding makes the other seem like a barbarian. It's a pretty impressive lesson, pretty important lesson. Let's move on to the next passage. This is from Romans 1, verse 14. I'm reading 13 and 14 to give some context. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you, as well as among the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation both to Greeks, Hellesin, and to barbarians, barbaros, both to the wise and to the foolish. So he says, tois loipois Hellesin, ethnesin, to the remaining Gentiles, to the rest of the Gentiles, to the rest of the nations, which includes Greeks and non-Greeks, those with philosophy and those without. He says, I'm under an obligation, opheletes eimi, I'm under an obligation to all of those people to try and reach them with the gospel. But notice that here, Paul accepts the notion that there are both linguistic and cultural differences, right? Because he says, not just the Greeks and the non-Greeks, but those with philosophy and without, the wise and the foolish. Barbaros or barbaroi, those who are the outsiders are not just linguistically, but also culturally. So where do the Jews fit into this? Another great question. Glad you asked. Let's take a look at Colossians 3, verse 11. Again, ESV, again, Koine supplied. Here, there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, barbaros, Scythian, slave, or free, but Christ is all and in all. So on the one hand, Paul sees the Jews as distinct from the Greeks and the Gentiles, right? Circumcised and uncircumcised. And he calls them out, Greeks and Jews, different people groups. But then he goes on and says there are other people groups too. It goes broader than that. There's the barbaros, the foreigners who have different language, Scythians, people who are going to be, who are an organized culture but are more Germanic. Then he gets socioeconomic, slave and free. He says none of that matters. He adopts this sort of Christian cosmopolitanism. In Christ, none of those distinctions matter. We're tribal. We break up into our different groups. We like the people who do things the way we do, who speak the same language as we do, who have the same ritual practices as we do. But in Christ, the gospel is going to dissolve those boundaries and bring us together in this sort of Christian cosmopolitanism. Cosmos, world, polite, citizen. We're all citizens of the same tribe. We come into the same world in Christ because in Christ those differences disappear. The language doesn't matter. The culture doesn't matter. The circumcision and the uncircumcision doesn't matter. In Christ is all and is in all. Pretty powerful stuff. So we've been dividing into tribes as long as we've existed. There are great books. There's a book called Tribe by Sebastian Junger that makes a compelling argument that part of our survival mechanism in our more primitive days is that those who didn't cling to their tribe and defend their tribe didn't get to pass their genes on, right? There's some logical merit in that. But Paul recognizes that while he does recognize those linguistic and cultural and geographical differences, he insists that the gospel tears down those walls and makes us all one. So if we could come away from this great word, barbaros, with any one great lesson, it's that the more we increase our own understanding, the fewer barbarians we'll encounter. And ultimately, if you approach the text of the New Testament from a devotional standpoint, rather than just an academic standpoint, a person who is in Christ ceases to see barbarians, but only sees brothers and sisters. Because Christ is all and is in all, right? Pretty awesome stuff. Barbaros, our word of the week. Those who chatter like birds, who speak in unintelligible sounds, who have different ways and means than we do, but ultimately, when all is said and done, in this Christian cosmopolitanism, this one world in Christ, there aren't any more barbarians when we understand each other. I hope this was good for you. It was good for me. And until next time, Charis Kai Reine Humin, grace and peace to you.